from the state of the art to the art of the possible. How do we use the state of the art to turn the art of the possible into the actual? And how do we use the art of the possible to think about how to change the state of the art so that it makes the art of the possible actual and makes more possible and more possible actual? I came across an article, actually my mole in the HHS world, Daniel Stein, passed this on to me a couple of weeks ago. An article by Derek Corson, Human Service Informatics, Notes in Supporting of an Emerging Wholeness, and what he spoke in his article about are the varieties of holistic human service information. This is the first page. You can't quite see the diagram here, but what it offers is, and let me just quote the beginning of his discussion. The word holistic comes up a lot when people talk about the human services. It's an ideal to be or become holistic. But what do people mean? What does holism have to do with managing information? People are striving towards something. It needs to be outlined more sharply. Otherwise, holism will be just a buzzword that befogs the mind. If we think we want holism, whatever that turns out to be, we should start by looking for clarity. And when I think about thinking about clarity, and when I think about thinking, and when I think about thinking in and outside the box, and when I think about thinking about the art of the possible and the state of the art, my starting point is always where Western thinking begins, that is, thinking about thinking. And that's Socrates and Plato, of course. For them, philosophy, philosophia, is the love of wisdom. So every form of inquiry for them fell under the same kind of roof. Everything is connected by definition to everything else. And that's where Western thinking about thinking begins. It was Plato's student Aristotle, and just to let you know that while Plato was smart, he wasn't perfect, he passed over Aristotle to become the dean of his school, and instead gave it to his nephew, but that's okay. Aristotle started his own school, so he didn't exactly get left out in the cold. So now we have two competing schools. And it was Aristotle who, in a sense, on the one hand, is responsible for the faulty siloing, which is one way in which we humans think, because he develops the concept of categories. So whereas for Socrates and Plato, all of thinking of whatever the subject matter falls ultimately under this large category of the love of wisdom, and that all is intended to tend toward the good. It's all about human improvement. Aristotle starts to break it up. So he has essays on the parts of animals. He has essays on the soul, on physics, on metaphysics, on ethics, on politics. So he is the siloist, in a sense, at the beginning of Western thought. On the other hand, he's also the one who articulates most distinctly the problematic with which over the next couple of days you guys are engaged. How does the potential become actual? And he talks about it in terms of a process, and when a process can be seen to have completed itself or to have changed a condition. So I'm building a house. At what point is the house a house? Is it when I put the structure, basic structure up, but the doors and windows aren't in yet? Okay, I put the doors and windows in, but I have subflooring but not the actual flooring. I've got all that stuff, but I don't have the doorknobs, or I don't have the light switches, or I don't have the plumbing. At what point does the process of building yield a building? Or thunk of a different way, I take the ship that is in drastic need of repair, my old ship, to the shipyard to be repaired. And they replace a few boards. And they replace a few more boards the next time. And they replace a few more boards. At what point does the ship that was an old ship with a few boards replacing the old boards with new become a new ship? And the significance of these kinds of models, as it were, has to do with the question of translating a potential into an actual condition. At what point does the potential for a new ship become actualized as a new ship? At what point does the potential for a house become actualized as a house? How do you get from the possible to the actual? How do you transform the state of the art so that it transforms the possible into the actual. What can we, what can you think about over the next 2 or 3 days about what can happen in HHS in the next 2 or 3 years that will transform the state of the art and therefore transform the art of the possible and transform the art of the possible into the actual? If we jump forward, skipping by Mr. Gutenberg, although he certainly was a perfect example, to a younger contemporary south of the Alps, a dude by the name of Leonardo da Vinci, who didn't work with printing presses, although he might have. He worked with just about everything else, but who was the consummate non-siloist in that he was constantly conscious of and thinking about everything that it was possible to think about and how everything relates to everything else. Leonardo, on the one hand, could be an innovator in art, particularly as a painter. One looks at one of his most ambitious, unfinished early works. It's a Madonna and Child within a larger context. He never actually got beyond the sketch to filling out the colors. And it's the whole structure that was something new. It was something that Raphael learned from Leonardo, and in turn other subsequent artists learned. So he was an innovator just in thinking about how to structure the composition of a painting. But Leonardo is perhaps better known, certainly in the general world, because of his combination of the art of art and the art of painting with the technology of how to make a painting. His most famous, ultimately, failure in that regard is, of course, The Last Supper. And on the one hand, The Last Supper is innovative visually, because prior to Leonardo in Western painting, Judas is always separated from the other apostles by being on the other side of the table. Our side of the table, by the way. They and Jesus are on that side, and Judas is with us on this side of the table. Leonardo changes that. Judas is amongst the apostles. How do we know who Judas is? He's the only one who's in shadow. So he changes the concept of how to think about betrayal in the context of how to think about painting. But that's a painting which you probably know is literally falling off the walls of the monastery outside Milan that commissioned him to do it, because he chose to use his own new technology of fresco making. And it turns out that while that technology might have worked under other circumstances, it couldn't work where he was working because there was too much moisture behind the walls. And so, in one sense, The Last Supper is a failure. But wow, what a magnificent failure. It's all about the mixing of art and technology. It's all about thinking outside the box. It's all about venturing beyond what is the norm to that which may or may not succeed in its venturing. When Mozart, jumping a few centuries later, began what amounts to the transformation of Western music from its Baroque to its classical phase, he who would have been his primary patron, the Archduke of the Habsburg Emperor, the Habsburg Emperor, was disturbed by what he referred to as so many notes. But of course, Mozart was not the wave of the past, he was the wave of the future. He was conceiving of music in a whole new way that the great Haydn and the great Handel and the great Bach, each great in his own way, hadn't thunk of music. And Mozart would become the basis for Beethoven, who becomes the basis for Brahms, well, and it leads up to the present time, of course. It was in the century after Mozart, the century of Beethoven and Brahms, that the guy who actually coined the phrase art of the possible operated in a political sphere, Otto von Bismarck. He was being interviewed on August 11th, 1867 to be precise, and in the context of the conversation with his interviewer, he used the phrase the art of the possible, and what he meant was, what I do, what we do, what I want to do politically, how I want to transform the Prussian state, how do I want to transform the technology of the Prussian army. And in fact, a few years later, of course, in the Franco-Prussian War, it was the success of the Bismarck-supported thinking outside the box technological transformation of the Prussian army that led to a disaster for the French, a success for the Prussians, and ultimately led to a transformation of the Prussian state itself. For that which had been the largest state among German-speaking states now became the largest province of a larger state now called Germany. So the very concept of national identity under Bismarck, connected to politics, connected to the technology of warfare, connected to the sense of self, was transformed with that kind of thinking. Of course, Bismarck, we might say, is the first political interoperability Nick, because that's what he was thinking about within that area of his interest and expertise. We can jump forward to our own time, to the 20th and 21st centuries, and we can look in the realm not of armaments and politics, but closely allied, the realm of security and its consequences. And we look at the aftermath of the tragedy of the Boston Marathon just a little more than a year ago, and the technology that so quickly led to the apprehension of the two young men who accomplished that heinous feat. And we compare it, how can we not, to 9/11, a different scale of event, of course, but what marked the tragedy of 9/11 was the failure to be interoperative, the failure to be holistic, the being stuck in siloed mentality that prevented our own security forces, if I can use that turn of phrase, from knowing what they might have known, could have known, should have known, and preventing a disaster from taking place. The question, of course, is not security for our purposes. The question is, how do we translate the success that the federal government has been pushing, and you'll hear more about that before these days are out, is pushing toward with respect to security. How do we translate that in federal and state and local terms to health and human services? What do we do to shape new facts on the ground over the next couple of years? How do we combine humanity and technology together to create something that is new? It's not lost on me that tomorrow, sandwiched between two technology megas, IBM and Google, we have personas. So the human element is literally placed tomorrow between two technological elements, and on Friday, Esri will be represented. So you've got three technological giants, each in its own way, trying to work how to be interoperable with each other and with human services, with what you guys are all about, in order to be holistic, in order to think as Socrates and Plato thought, always holistically, about the human. What is the human being? It's not just a body, that's a carapace that contains within it a mind and a spirit, a soul. So to be holistic where humans are concerned is to think about what we are in terms of body and spirit and mind. It's to think about where we fit into the larger context of each other and, of course, the world around us. How does that combine with the extraordinary technological advances that we have in the age of IBM and the age of Google, in order to think outside the box, in order to transform the state of the art, in order to transform the art of the possible to something that is actual? How far outside the box can we think? How many of the multiple possibilities for any given issue, idea, question, or problem can we come up with? How many different aspects of the art of the possible are there before us? What can we learn from each other, and not just from Plato or Socrates or Aristotle or Gutenberg or Leonardo or Mozart or Bismarck or security services, with respect to humans at the center of health and human services, humans? How far into the future can we think? Not the NBA, but I can't not think about sports after all, because that's the important stuff in the world. The quarterback doesn't just think about the person to whom he expects to throw the ball. He has got to have the whole field within his field of vision, or while he's planning that throw, he's going to be blindsided from the other side. And if the man to whom he wants to throw the ball is covered, he's got to think of whom else can he throw it to, or can he run? He's got to have the whole field and not just a siloed element of it at his command. His coach is already thinking the next 3 plays forward for the same sort of reason. If the game is to be won in the game that you're playing, is the most serious game of all, of course. It pertains to the future of human beings and the welfare of human beings. Think of the chess master, who is always thinking 6 moves beyond the move he is or she is making, because that's how you play chess. Think of Isaac Asimov, who on the one hand said, you know, science fiction, that IBM session is called fact or fiction, right? Asimov once famously said, science fiction is limited by science, because the science fiction writer has to imagine and can't imagine beyond the capabilities of science. But on the other hand, he was wrong, and he himself proves he's wrong. Because when he started writing the iRobot series, just to give one example, robotics wasn't even a baby, much less the kind of developed idea that it would become in part perhaps, because of what he imagined as a science fiction writer, he the scientist. So scientists could look at that and think, well, maybe we could do that sort of thing. So let me come full circle to wrap up. First, to Plato and Socrates, where I began, whose mode of engagement of philosophia, the love of wisdom, and all of its component parts, was based methodologically on dialogue. The importance of dialogue for Socrates and Plato is that it engages those involved in it, not only if there are 2 or 3 of us actually doing it, but if it gets written down and you or I are reading this dialogue between, let's say, Socrates and Euthyphro, we find ourselves thinking when Socrates asks a question how Euthyphro might respond, or when Euthyphro responds how Socrates might pose the next question. It is dialogue about engagement. It's about being active and not just passively, okay listening, okay reading. Second, full circle, the medium, obviously, for Plato and Aristotle and Socrates is language. And language, of course, is that most human of skills and attributes and enterprises. To come back to the article that I pointed to at the beginning, the Derek Curson article, the diagram that he places up at the outset is a diagram of, well, certain degrees of what you might call holistic or interoperability. And he gives different examples where one individual is engaged by different services, or many individuals are engaged by one service, or many individuals are engaged by many services. And when I saw this article, I said, wait, I've seen that diagram. And I remembered back to my student days that around the time of Bismarck, when linguistics was further developing as a science, that's the kind of diagram that was used to refer to the relationship among languages that are related to each other. So if you think, for example, you won't be tested on this afterwards, but if you think, for example, of, let's say, French, forgive me, Spanish and Italian, 3 languages which we understand to be related because they come from a common ancestor, which is Latin. They're obviously not identical with each other, but there are areas in which they overlap in different ways. So if you take the verb to do, in French and in Italian, there's nothing in the middle but a vowel. Faire is French, fare is Italian. Spanish has a consonant in the middle. It's hacer, or if you're a Castilian, hacer, right? So Spanish in that sense is different from French and Italian, but French and Italian also share the first phoneme, which is an F, and Spanish removes that phoneme and replaces it with a H, right? So it's hacer. But you could take another set of words where you find Spanish and Italian overlapping, or forms of syntax. You know how we in English can distinguish between I do and I am doing, I speak and I am speaking? You can't make that distinction in French. But you can make it in Italian and Spanish. They overlap there where French doesn't. So there are different ways in which these 3 languages overlap and yet are distinct from each other. And I realized, of course, that's the same sort of model that Corson is talking about for health and human services. And of course, that's pretty appropriate that it's a model that ultimately is first used in linguistics, since language is the ultimate human instrument. And that's, of course, what you're about the next 3 days. You're about talking about it. But for Plato and Socrates, language, logos, talking about it, is supposed to lead to action, ergon. Otherwise, it's nothing but talk, or to re-quote Corson, otherwise holism will just be a buzzword that befogs the mind. You have to think about it. You have to talk about it. You have to do it. The art of the possible is the art of the potential. Possible comes from the Latin posse, meaning to be able. Potential comes from the Latin potens, meaning powerful. They come from the same root. Possibility and power are from the same linguistic root. Interoperative, holistic thinking is what connects the roots to its diverse branches and makes the tree really live. And that's what I hope you'll be engaged in over the next couple of days. Thank you very much.